Hello there. Welcome to Explain Apologetics. I am thrilled, excited that today we have not one guest. Our typical procedure has always been to have one guest. Today, it's double the joy for us here at Explain Apologetics. We have two guests with us. You'll remember, of course, both of them because they've both been on our channel in the last 1 or 2 weeks. Correct me. Pardon me if I'm mistaken. On the one hand, we are grateful to have back again Brother Pepper Lim, who, as I mentioned and introduced him the last time, was a former Christian lay minister who became atheist. And we had a fun chat that we had, and just really glad you could be back, Pepper.
Thank you. I enjoyed myself in the first one, so I thought I'll enjoy myself again in the second one.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to all the fun tonight. And on the other hand, just to give a bit of backstory for those of you who are not quite sure, why is Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy back again? He's our second guest today. Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy is an evolutionary biologist. He is a established Christian debater. He has debated some of the well-known atheists such as Peter Atkins, Alex O'Connor, better known as Cosmic Skeptic. That's just in the atheistic world. He's also debated Muslims such as Dr. Shabir Ali, and there's a whole lot. It will take a long time just to go through the list that he has debated. So he's joining us today, but this is not a debate. We just want to have a friendly, casual conversation on evolution. And the other thing that I needed to mention was that Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy is assistant professor of biology at Sadler College, Boston. He will be sharing his view on evolution, and maybe I'll just throw it to Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy. Really glad that you could join us again, Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy. Could you just tell us why, what interested you to want to do this, after that interview that I had with Pepper Lim?
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here and great to meet Pepper as well. I really enjoyed watching Pepper's interview with yourself, Samuel, and I was really fascinated to find out that he used to be a Christian lay minister at a church and now self-identifies as an atheist. I personally am a very staunch evidentialist, meaning that I believe that Christianity is true because I'm persuaded by the public evidence of its veracity. And so I was very interested to hear that someone who had once been a Christian now self-identifies as an atheist, or one who's rejected or come to be persuaded of the falsehood of the Christian faith. And so I wanted to run past Pepper some of my some of the reasons and evidences and arguments that have persuaded me of Christianity's truth. And also he brought up the subject of evolutionary biology as one of the major driving factors behind his loss of faith. And this was particularly interesting to me because I actually have a PhD in evolutionary biology, and I'm not persuaded by the ability of natural selection and chance genetic mutation to explain the appearance of design. Of course, Charles Darwin's main contribution to the field of biology was his idea that natural selection coupled with chance variations, which we now know to be explained by genetic mutations that occur in DNA. Of course, that wasn't known to Darwin at the time, but natural selection and chance variation could explain the appearance of design without recourse to a designer. Of course, the idea of universal common ancestry is something which was not new with Darwin. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, and I think that you can make a case for the proposition of common ancestry. But I think really the key locus of contention at this point is whether natural selection and chance genetic mutation can explain all of the overwhelming appearance of design in biology. And if it can't, then I think maybe we need to consider whether things appear to be designed in biology because they really were designed. So I'm interested to hear Pepper's perspective on that. Perhaps we could start by talking about the information content in the cell. Information content, of course, is required to explain the origins of the first life. We've known since the 1950s that life is chock full of digitally encoded information content, right? In 1957, Francis Crick first proposed that chemicals called bases along the spine of the sugar phosphate backbone of DNA function as alphabetic characters in written language or digital characters in a machine code. And we know that that digital information provides the instruction set for production of proteins, which are the building blocks of the molecular machines that we find in the cell. And we know from every realm of experience of cause and effect, whether we're looking at the paragraphs of a book or a computer programming script or what have you, that form of information content uniformly arises from intelligent causes, not from stochastic, unguided chance and necessity. So I'd be interested, Pepper, in your perspective on that information argument for design as an explanation for biology.
Okay. Could you explain it to me like I was 5? Could you repeat your question and in a way that it was yeah.
Of course. So I'm interested in how you would account for the presence of biological information content, which and in particular the fact that we know that information content arises in all of our uniform based experience, which is the basis of scientific inquiry about the past. That it always arises from intelligent causes. So there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity. And so the abductive historical method, which was pioneered by Charles Lyell, who was a mentor to Charles Darwin, basically argues that if you want to explain events in the remote past, then you need to let your present experience of the cause and effect structure of the world guide that search for the best explanation. And so when we find information content in the context of the cell, and we know that information is habitually associated with conscious activity or intelligent design, then I think it's a reasonable inference using that abductive historical method to infer that indeed that information content is best accounted for, best explained by an intelligent cause, not by an unguided one. Does that make sense?
Okay, can I try to explain it back to you to see whether I understood what you just said?
Certainly.
Okay, are you asking me why there is a variety of life on Earth, and how can they all come by if it wasn't by some sort of intelligent design? Like why are there a variety of horses and fishes and birds? Even down to bacteria and viruses, how can there be so much variety if it wasn't, because it looks like it really came from some intelligent design? Is that what you're asking me?
Not really, although we could get to that later if you want. But the question more pertained to the origins of information content at all. So DNA, as you may be familiar with, is comprised of it's a chemical language system, and there's 4 chemical subunits that we represent with the alphabetic characters of A, C, T, and G. And the sequential arrangement of those chemical subunits, or nucleotides as they're called, determines in turn the sequential arrangement of the amino acids that form the building blocks of proteins. And so to get the simplest type of cell, so some of the simplest cells out there include organisms like mycoplasma genitalium, which is an obligate parasite. Even to get a simple cell up and running, you need some 200 or 300 genes coding for proteins, and that requires a huge amount of information input. And so it seems to me that that sort of information content, that digitally encoded information content, in fact, the genetic code itself, because you have this language system, this mapping, if you will, from these words. So in DNA language, there's 3-letter words known as codons, and there's 64 different codons, and each of these 3-letter words codes for an amino acid, which forms the building blocks of proteins. And that decoding system, if you will, it's known as the genetic code, again, points, I think, to design, because in every other realm of experience, when we find that sort of language system, it's always associated with design. And so in the absence of any better explanation or any even adequate explanation to explain or account for that language system, I think that design is the best or most causally adequate explanation for the information system. Would you not agree?
Okay, so let me try to explain it back to you again, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead, Pepper. Yeah, so
Sam, Did you understand that, Sam?
Yeah, I think what he's trying to, I think what Dr. McLatchie is trying to say is that there's an information found in the gene code, and when there's information there, you know, you can decipher. It's like a language, building blocks of amino acids and all that, and that basically seems to provide evidence for intelligent design and not something that is just randomly there. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. McLatchie, is that a fair summary?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So he's asking if you think that that accounts for that information actually points to an intelligent designer. When you look at that, yeah.
Okay, I've never really looked at the beginnings of life, the very simple life forms, and from the molecular point of view. I've come across it before, but I didn't take much interest in it. So I think the shortest answer is I don't know. I don't know, and I haven't looked into it. But if you ask me if that could be true, I would have to say that that probably isn't true, because if you look at the other bulk of evidence that we have for evolution, then I'll have to say that there is no intelligent design, because we all know that, from my point of view, this me talking, okay? I'm saying I observe that all kinds of life forms are defective. They are imperfect. They have some sort of, they're vulnerable to disease. That's my biggest gripe with living things. You know, that's why. If an intelligent designer had designed it, they would have made it perfect. I mean, if you looked at let's say like the watchmaker's watch, you would probably, if an intelligent person made the watch, then he would try to make it like as best as he can and not have a watch that, oh, it tells time. It tells time just as well. But no, we notice that as watches progress, they also try to make it better. They try to put new things in it. They try to make it more efficient. They even try to make it even more accurate. Yeah, so to me, when somebody tells me intelligent design, so I really have to think, okay, if God is the intelligent designer, then the things that are designed would have to be perfect because of this perfect God. But we are nowhere near perfect. And this is, I think this is my biggest stumbling block when we talk about intelligent design.
Yeah, so there's a few things there. First of all, in the design systems that you see in your everyday experience, are all of these perfectly designed?
No.
No, so it doesn't necessarily follow that if something is designed, then it's designed perfectly, right?
Yes, correct.
Right, and it's also possible where there's something that is where in order to optimize a particular purpose for your design system, then you make another change which would render it apparently suboptimal in another instance. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay.
So you agree in principle that you could have design constraints that are imposed by the need to have trade-offs in your designing of a system, right?
Yes, but doesn't that sound like survival of the fittest and Darwin's what species is it called? The where nature favors the species that can survive.
Yeah, survival of the fittest.
Mm-hmm. Survival of the fittest. Yeah, survival of the fittest, and yeah. So doesn't that sound like that?
Well, I mean, no one's contesting that survival of the fittest is a thing. It's just the question of whether it's causally adequate to explain what needs to be explained. But I think the suboptimal design thesis or objection that you highlighted suffers from another serious issue, and that is that it is actually, you've probably heard of the God of the gaps fallacy, right? Say that I can't explain feature X, so therefore I'll just plug in God as a kind of a placeholder for that of which we are ignorant. I think that actually what the objection that you just made does is it it makes a parallel fallacy, which I would call a Darwin of the gaps objection. And that is to say that we can't explain why God designed it that way, and so therefore it will just plug in evolution as a placeholder of that which we're ignorant, rather than continuing to investigate. And maybe it turns out that these systems are, in fact, designed the way they are for a reason. And in fact, there have been cases where such systems have turned out not to be suboptimally designed after all, but actually have a design purpose. The inverse wiring of the vertebrate retina is one such example of that, where actually it was once thought that it was suboptimally designed, and it turns out that that there's actually a design purpose for the way that the vertebrate retina is wired. So I think that it's an argument from ignorance. It's an argument based not on what we do know about these systems, but on what we don't know. And actually, I think a design perspective encourages us to continue looking for functions and for reasons why something's designed the way it is, even if we don't fully, even if we don't yet understand. It's an impetus for continued scientific investigation into why these systems are designed the way they are. Whereas I think the Darwinian paradigm would encourage us more to or discourages us from continuing to look for explanations, and actually encourages us to throw up our hands and say, well, it must be suboptimally designed just because we don't exactly know why it's designed the way it is. Does that make sense?
Yes, but yeah. So what you're saying is things are the way they are because they are designed. But then when someone brings up the objection that, look, it's not adequately designed, so your reasoning is, look, you don't know that it's not adequately designed. Maybe it was designed that way. You think it's a bad design, but in actual fact, there was reasoning behind that bad design. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So to give an example, I mentioned the inverse wiring of the vertebrate retina, which is probably the most popular example that's given of suboptimal design in biology. And essentially, so retinal cells require a very large oxygen supply, and so they therefore require a very large blood supply. And of course, blood cells absorb light, and if blood cells invade retinal cells, then the result of that can be blindness. And so that entails that the retinal cells need to receive a blood supply from vessels which don't block the light. And since red blood cells readily absorb light, this demand requires that the retina be wired in the manner in which it is. And it is often pointed out that squids and octopuses have correctly wired retinas that face outward, but these organisms are exothermic, so they don't require the same blood supply to the retina. So, and there's other examples I could talk about where it was once thought that they were suboptimally designed, but then further investigation shows actually there is a design reason for them being engineered the way they are. And so it seems that those discoveries suggest that your objection to design from apparently suboptimal design is a Darwin of the gaps fallacy, in the sense that you're basically discouraging us from continuing to investigate, and whereas design actually has heuristic value as a hypothesis, in that it actually encourages us to investigate, okay, why is it designed the way it is? Is there some sort of design trade-off, or is there a reason why the designer decided to design it the way he did? Does that make sense?
Yes. However, I still don't understand why a designer would just leave a design for a design trade-off. I understand if, let's say, you have in a very simple analogy, if you had a laptop and you have a very lousy screen, and then when asked why you bought a laptop with a lousy screen because all the latest screens are 4K, then you say, well, because I only had this much money to spend, therefore I could only afford this the old 1K screen. So I can understand if there's that kind of trade-off. But when I think of God, I kind of think of him being this perfect designer. So he would know how to get around the trade-offs and not have trade-offs. So I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, you're assuming a lot about God's intentions in the design, and I mean, we're not God, as we just we don't have the level of technological sophistication to know exactly what goes into designing biological systems. They're way beyond they're way beyond human engineering in terms of their prowess and their incredible design. So I'm not convinced that it's easy to make a convincing argument that God should have done it this way and that there is a better way of doing it if we just don't have access to that sort of information. I mean, I'm curious what sort of arguments persuade you that that evolution is true. I mean, one other point I would make on that is that you could have design constraints that are imposed by common ancestry. So the hypothesis I'm putting forward of design is not at all incompatible with common ancestry, because common ancestry is it is only a pattern, right? And natural selection would be a process that purports to explain that pattern. So there's this pattern versus process distinction. You could have the pattern of hereditary continuity, descent with modification from common ancestors, going back, as you wind the table of life back far enough, to a single universal common ancestor, a universal progenitor of all life that we see around us today. Let's just grant that for the sake of argument. But then for Darwin's objection to design to work, you have to demonstrate that natural selection coupled with chance variation, which is driven by mutations, is sufficient to explain the appearance of design without invoking a designer. And so far as I see, it isn't. But if common ancestry were true, which we can grant hypothetically, then it could explain some of these design constraints, because these design systems are constrained by their evolutionary heritage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, interesting. I've never really heard this argument before, so you have to forgive me if I'm taking a long time to process it. I've always thought it was very black and white. It was either God designed everything, from start to finish, so there's no changes along the way, and then there's evolution, which just took everything and just whatever came out of this survival of fittest, natural selection. That's what we have today. So yeah. This the first I've heard it explained from your point of view. So
right. I'm just wondering whether I just thought of jumping in, and maybe just can because I think that was the question Dr. Mcclatchy kind of like through which actually I meant to be my first question as well for Pepper. That is, what was your reasons? I mean, what are some of the reasons that you feel led you? Because this is a personal conversation we are having here. What are some of the reasons that led you to believe in evolution, as opposed to, for example, belief in God? Apart from the one that we've kind of touched on, what are the main reasons?
So the big reason is I was a creationist before. So I believe that God had created everything like perfect, like all the human beings and all the tigers, the different types of tigers, and then put them all over the world, in Siberia, in Malaya, and in India, and everything on Earth was just designed as it is, and then put on Earth by God. So this mutation and evolution, changing over long periods of time, this just didn't gel with me, because that's not what the Bible teaches. So I was a creationist for a long time, and then many years back, I decided to just take myself out of the picture and just look at both sides and just have a look. And when I looked at evolution again from a neutral point of view, I realized that it was a better way of explaining life on Earth than what the Bible says, the way that God had created everything perfect, etc., etc. And like I said, one of the things that I noticed with evolution, and it explains why there's organisms on Earth are imperfect. That like you said, there are design trade-offs, and the octopus has a better eye. And like my biggest gripe is, why do people fall sick? So So this is the thing that made me realize that evolution is the correct one, and intelligent design is the wrong one. Because from my point of view, if intelligent design was from God, then it would be perfect. Like we will all live like in harmony. There's no sicknesses, and people would you'll be able to see in the dark like a cat. Why should the cat have a better eye than you? You'll be able to run like a dog. Why should the dog run faster than you? This is in my mind. This is the kind of things I envision when I say God created all the living things on earth.
Mm. Although it seems that your objection is more to do with suffering, right, rather than being impressed by the evidence for evolution.
So I think that evolution explains the imperfections, not just suffering, but the imperfections of living things. Why some trees grow really tall and some trees some plants creep on the. If you ask if survival of the fittest would be a really good answer to explain why some plants are really tall and some creep, because they all need to get sunlight. They're all fighting for sunlight to survive. And the ones that cannot creep or cannot grow tall, they're the ones that die. And we do see this happening for extinct organisms like dinosaurs and long ago plants that are not alive today anymore. Well, because they just could not survive as our world changes, climate change, and etc. So I think the evolution, survival of the fittest, mutation, these are better answers, better explanations than to say God had designed it this way. So
okay. But the question that we really want to address is: does natural selection and the Darwinian synthesis that goes with it, or intelligent design, better explain biological complexity? And because if natural selection and chance genetic mutation and other similarly unguided mindless processes cannot account for what we see in biology, if it's just constantly impotent, then even if these design defects that you perceive are improbable on the hypothesis of design, they're still far more probable on the hypothesis of design than they are on the hypothesis of unguided stochastic mechanisms. Right. So, because when we're looking at evidence, we really want to evaluate the strength of evidence in terms of a ratio. That is, the probability of your evidence existing given that your hypothesis is true versus the probability of that same evidence existing given that your hypothesis is wrong, right? And so even if the probability of your evidence existing assuming your hypothesis to be correct is very low, if it's higher than the probability of that same evidence existing given your hypothesis is false, it's still evidence for your hypothesis, not against it. So when it comes to explaining biological complexity, we should ask, what do we need to explain? So I mentioned the DNA codes for, one of the things it does is it codes for the sequential arrangement of the amino acid subunits that determine the three-dimensional structure of protein folds. And in a typical, in a monocyl-length protein of say 150 amino acids, there's 20 raised to the power of 150 possible ways of arranging those amino acids, right? That's a huge combinatorial space when you think about it. I mean, there's only 10 to the 80 subatomic particles in the known universe. So there's a huge combinatorial space of ways of arranging those amino acid sequences. And we know that a lot of these sequences are functional and a lot of these are not functional. And so the question that we can ask is, what is the ratio of functional and stable protein structures within that vast array of combinatorial possibilities? Because if it's astronomically small, then that would be much more consistent with the design perspective than it would be by a chance and necessity perspective, where on a Darwinian view, if it was astronomically small, you would expecting a random search driven by random genetic mutation to stumble upon a tiny, tiny needle in an enormous, astronomically sized haystack, to find these functional sequences by chance. And there's been work published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature trying to adjudicate the answer to that question. So, for instance, there's actually various studies published on this, but one example that's quite frequently cited is was published in 2004 in the Journal of Molecular Biology by a molecular biologist called Doug X, who at the time was a postdoc at Cambridge University. And he took a particular enzyme complex called beta-lactamase, and which is an enzyme which confers antibiotic resistance to penicillin. And he performed what's called a site-directed mutagenesis experiment, where he sought to determine he modified the amino acid sequence in that protein, trying to determine what's the ratio of functional protein structures within that vast array of combinatorial possibilities. And according to his estimate, it was 1 in 10 to the 74th power of meaningful amino acid sequences that actually form a stable and functional structure. And there are other studies in the literature which have similar estimates. In the English language, sentences convey meaning and communication because there's far more ways of writing gibberish than there are ways of writing meaningful sentences, right? And it turns out that the same is true in biology, that there's far more ways of arranging amino acids to spell out gibberish than there are ways of arranging amino acids to spell out an actual functional protein structure. And so the question then arises, is this better explained by design, where if you're searching for a very, very small target in this enormous haystack, or is it better explained by a random blind search? And it seems that given the time that's elapsed since the beginning of the beginning of the universe, or have you, it seems that it's not nearly enough time to explain what needs to be explained. And so it seems to me to point better towards design as the most causally adequate or sufficient explanation. Does that make sense?
Yes. So what I've been trying to explain it back to you to see if I understood it.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is the DNA sequence, the code, you could get more gibberish out of it. There's a higher chance of it being gibberish, 10 to the power of 74 something. Then it is to be arranged in such a way that it would form life, a meaningful life, right?
Yeah, meaningful protein folds, right, which are the building blocks of molecular machines. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about, but this reminds me of Richard Dawkins. He wrote a software, if I'm not mistaken, that tried to mimic this, and he explained it in his documentary. I think it's called The Blind Watchmaker. He tried to explain this by saying that what if it's not just random, but every time the code did something meaningful, it would remember and keep the good stuff and just change the bad stuff until it became a meaningful code. That if I'm not mistaken, that's how he explained it.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. It's called. He thinks it's like a weasel, and he was. You summarized it quite accurately. The problem is that he's actually smuggling in information into the system. So he's already, he assumes, for example, that if he obtains one letter of the sequence, that he retains that, and then the others are searching, and then he finds another letter, and so forth. Whereas when it comes to explaining biological complexity, it's very, very different. And notice that he smuggled the information into the system. Because natural selection doesn't have foresight. Natural selection is not looking for a particular target in the way that Dawkins' program is. But when we're looking at biological systems, you need multiple changes to happen simultaneously. And I think that is one of the key problems or deficiencies with the neo-Darwinian mechanism of selection and chance mutation. To explain, for example, an irreducibly complex system where you require multiple coordinated changes to happen together in order to affect an outcome, in order to get something of selective benefit to the organism. And when you look at, so there's a whole field in evolutionary biology called population genetics, which is the mathematical expression of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. And population genetics attempts to estimate, okay, what are the waiting times for a particular mutation to arise in the population, given that we know the average mutation rates, the population sizes, and the generation turnover times. And there's also another, so the waiting time is, okay, how long do we have to wait before a particular mutation is going to arise in the population? And then there's another level, there's another waiting time involved, which is the waiting time to fixation of a mutation. It's not just enough to get a mutation. It's got to go from being the lone individual out there that has that mutation, that has that gene variant or allele, to becoming the norm that gets established in the population, right? And so you've got two waiting time problems. There was a paper published in Journal of Genetics in 2008 by two mathematicians called Rick Durrett and Dina Schmidt. And they basically start to calculate or estimate what's the waiting time of a mutation to arise in a hominid population, assuming, so until very recently, the effective population size in hominids was about 20,000 individuals per generation. And they calculated that you would require about 216 million years for a two-step coordinated mutation to happen in a hominid lineage, given the mutation rates, the generation turnover times, and the population sizes. When you look at something like, when you consider that the human-chimp divergence is thought to have happened about around 6 million years ago, that I think presents a problem. Furthermore, if you take an example like the evolution of the whale, which is is often taken as a flagship example of evolution in action in the fossil record, where you go from a terrestrial mammal called Pagocetus to a full-blown aquatic whale called Dorodon or Basilosaurus within a very narrow window of geological time. The most generous estimates in the literature are 9 million years, but you can make a case for it being far shorter than that. But we can go with 9 million years. When it comes to the population genetics, there's an evolutionary biologist by the name of Richard Sternberg, who lives in Seattle. He basically took the equations from that Durrett and Schmidt paper in 2008, and he modified the equations to say, okay, we're dealing with more individuals and so forth, to calculate, okay, what's the estimated waiting time for a pair of mutations to arise in this population of terrestrial mammals. And he calculated a waiting time of 43.3 million years for a two-step coordinated mutation. Now, what sort of mutations do you need to get from a terrestrial land-based mammal to a fully aquatic whale? Well, just think about it. You need a special lung surfactant, because when whales dive and come back to the surface, the lung needs to re-expand very quickly. You need reduction of the hind limbs. The forelimbs have to be transformed into flippers. You need reorganization of kidney tissue for intake of salt water instead of just fresh water. You need modification of the mammary glands for nursing young underwater. You need a reorientation of the fetus for giving birth underwater. You need one of the most incredible engineering feats or changes that's required is the introduction of an intra-abdominal current heat exchange system. Because in mammals, if the testes fail to descend and they're not cooled, you get sterility, which is obviously an evolutionary dead end. Whereas in whales, the testes are actually inside the body, right next to the muscles that generate heat during swimming. And so you have to actively cool down the gland, which is done in a manner akin to a modern refrigeration system by shunning cooled blood from the tail flukes to a nexus of arteries and veins that dissipates heat from the gland. So the testes remain below core body temperature while the whale is moving in the water column. And if you assume that just 2 mutations are necessary to affect that change, just one mutation, say, to get the testes inside the body, another mutation to introduce that elaborate intra-abdominal current heat exchange system, then you're looking at at least 43 million years for that to occur. But for the whole transition, if you take the fossil record seriously, you have less than 9 million years. So how do you account for that? It seems that that is better explained by design than it is by chance and necessity. And the reason I bring that up is because you mentioned Dawkins and Weasel program, and the problem there is that he's smuggling information into the system. If it matches up with the target sequence and it's kept, if it doesn't match, then it's not kept. And natural selection doesn't work like that. Natural selection requires multiple coordinated changes in order to accomplish what needs to be accomplished, because most adaptive innovations are multiple mutations away and require multiple changes to happen simultaneously in a coordinated fashion. Does that make sense?
Yes. But what I still don't get why you don't think that 9 million years is enough time. I mean, it's 9 million years, not even counting, and we're not talking about one wolf who's suddenly taken 9 million years to change into a whale. We are talking about probably, if I understand it correctly, several of these kinds of species who jumped in the water trying to maybe escape the enemy or look for food. Some would have died along the way and did not survive. And the ones who could adapt to jumping into the water gradually turned into whales over 9 million years. And I think that's okay for evolution. No, even though now you say that 9 million years is too short, I think 9 million years is way too long if it's intelligent design. If somebody has sat down to design a whale, then I think that we would just see whales that are not related to land wolves.
Yeah, the problem here is that you're assuming certain things about the designer which you don't know and you can't demonstrate. And furthermore, as I said earlier, even if God taking so long is, or the transition taking so long is improbable on the hypothesis of design. Let's just say that for the sake of argument. I'm not sure that is the case, but let's just say for the sake of argument, yes, on the hypothesis of design, that's very improbable. It's still far more probable than the hypothesis of evolution. Because and you asked why do I think 9 million years is too short, and the answer is simply mathematics. The mathematical expression of neo-Darwinian evolution is population genetics, and the population genetics evidence, the discipline of population genetics allows us to construct these mathematical models to evaluate how long is it going to take based upon what we know about the average mutation rates, the turnover times, population sizes for a mutation to arise, and then to become fixed in the population. In fact, if in cases where the population size is large, then the waiting time for a mutation to arise decreases because you have more individuals to factor into your probabilistic resources, if you will. More individuals for the mutations to happen in, whereas the waiting time to fixation will increase because you have more individuals for the mutation to sweep through. On the other hand, when the population size is small, then your waiting time for the mutation to arise is going to increase because you have fewer individuals for the mutation to potentially happen in. But the waiting time is going to the waiting time for fixation is going to decrease because you've got fewer individuals for the mutation to sweep through. So there's no easy way to work around the waiting time problem. And I think that's a fundamental difficulty with the evolutionary scenario of natural selection and genetic mutation. And not to mention, of course, molecular systems which require multiple interacting components in order to perform a job. So for instance, DNA replication, which is fundamental to cell division, is fundamental to hereditary, because you cannot pass on your genes if you can't replicate them. And natural selection, of course, it's difficult to invoke natural selection to explain the existence of genetic replication because you have to presuppose the existence of the very thing you're trying to explain, because natural selection requires the ability to replicate your genome. But when we look at the level of complexity involved in replicating the genome, you require the helicase to unwind the DNA molecule ahead of the replication fork. You require the DNA polymerase itself to synthesize the new complementary strand. During the replication process, you require the single-stranded binding proteins to stop the two strands reannealing with each other. You require the DNA polymerase clamp, which clamps the polymerase onto the strand as it's replicating. There's also a clamp loader, which loads the sliding clamp onto the strand. You need a primase, which basically isn't required to initiate synthesis in the first place, because the polymerase isn't able to start replicating on its own, so it needs an RNA primase to synthesize an RNA primer, and so forth. And there, I mean, that's just a very simplistic sketch of the complexity required in DNA replication. I can give hours of content on that. But the difficulty is that if any of these components is missing, then you don't have DNA replication that works half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to, but it's broken. It doesn't work at all. And so when you require when you have a process that requires foresight, that seems to require multiple interacting components that couldn't be built up by a gradual, stepwise Darwinian type of pathway, that seems to me to be better explained by design, because intelligent designers uniquely have the capacity to visualize a complex endpoint and bring everything together to actualize or realize that endpoint, that end goal, whereas unguided, mindless processes don't. And so that seems to me to be why these systems point towards design as the best explanation. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. I don't know enough to be able to comment on that or even ask you further questions on that. But I do seem to remember watching some evolutionary documentaries on evolution that kind of explains how those proteins and DNA evolved and you know are passed on. But I don't know enough to be able to tell you my point of view. I really have no. Yeah. I don't know much about this in order to talk to you further.
Sure. Perhaps then we can move on to talking about the evidence for Christianity specifically.
I've got a question, but you said something that was quite interesting. You said that you don't know what the intelligent purpose, the intelligent designers' purpose of a certain quote unquote mistake that we find in nature. Would that be fair?
So there are some cases where we don't know. There are some cases like the example I gave of the inverse wiring of the vertebrate retina, where I think there is evidence that shows that there is a design purpose or design reason. But my point was that the argument against design from suboptimal design or apparently suboptimal design is to make a Darwin of the gaps fallacy, because you're assuming that there is a suboptimality when further research might in fact reveal, as it has done in the past, that there isn't any. Okay,
so I've got a question for that. If a Christian doesn't know why God would have created that in that way, wouldn't it be just easy to just pray and ask him for the answer and then just tell everybody that that's the reason why? It's instead of us doing more tests and experiments to try and derive the answer ourselves?
So I think that God promotes scientific inquiry. In fact, God introduces the scientific field of taxonomy, of course, in Genesis, where he instructs Adam to name the animals, and Adam and Eve are given a dominion over the animals, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and so forth. And I think that scientific inquiry is something which God promotes, and I think that it's not God's purpose to give us all the answers on a plate, but rather he wants us to investigate the natural world and to use scientific tools of inquiry to investigate his creation.
Interesting that you just said that, because I cannot think of anywhere in the Bible that actually points to God saying, "Listen, I've created you guys, but I'm sure you don't know what's going on, but try and find out on your own." But yeah, so I don't know. Is there such a verse in the Bible?
It's not. I mean, I don't think that Scripture is intended to be a scientific textbook. I don't think that. I mean, the purpose of Scripture is to provide spiritual illumination, spiritual information, and information concerning salvation, and it gives us historical reports concerning God's dealings in history. but it's not the purpose of Scripture to give us an account of or a detailed account of science. In fact, that would have been completely lost on the original audience to which Scripture was delivered,
Right.
who were not scientifically literate people, because they lived well before the scientific revolution occurred. So I think your argument is assuming that God's purpose is to give us scientific understanding on a plate rather than us actually investigating it. And in fact, if you look at in Genesis 3, God says to Adam, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And so the idea is that part of the curse was that mankind was to work, and by the sweat of his brow he would eat. And I think likewise God expects us to work when it comes to learning scientific information, scientific facts about the world.
This is really contrary to what I've been taught, and this reminds me of Ken Ham's closing statements. Every time he has a seminar, he would say, you know why scientists don't know? Because scientists were not there at the beginning of time. And then he will ask the audience, who was there at the beginning of time? The audience always answered God. And he said, well, were scientists there at the beginning of time? And everybody will answer no. And he would say, that's why God knows. And it's always, I've always felt that God would know the answer, and we should seek God, and the answer will be revealed to us. And then science would then prove the answer that we received from God. So, for instance, if just as an analogy off the top of my head, if let's say 1,000 years ago, some holy man was to say that, the air that you breathe, it actually contains 30 types of molecules, 30 different types of air. You don't know it now, but I'm just telling you that that's the amount of gases that are in the air. You think there's one, but actually there's other things called, well, today we know it's nitrogen and hydrogen and whatever. And then, later on we find that, hey, that guy is right. And how did he know? Well, because he had talked to God, and God, being the creator of air, revealed to him that the air is just not air. It's made up of all these other gases. So how did he know? Well, he didn't know, but God knew. So coming from a Ken Ham kind of student, maybe you could say that. Yeah. So I've always had that kind of thinking that God would know. So our job is to get God to answer it, and then science would then prove that God that what God said is true. But this is the first time I've heard that we don't know, and we can't ask God, and we have to look for the answers ourselves.
I'm sorry. I did see in your previous interview with Sam that you, when you were a Christian, were heavily influenced by Ken Ham. And I'm sorry to hear that he misled you. Actually, I've come across or encountered a lot of Christians who've been so misled by Ken Ham's material that they've lost their faith when they discover the evidence for the antiquity of the earth, the vast age of the earth. And in fact, Ken Ham likes to wedge the truth of Christianity to his particular interpretation of Genesis, which results in an earth that's 6,000 years old. And when people discover, as they do during college, that actually the earth is much older than 6,000 years, then they chuck the baby out with the bathwater, rather than just modifying their interpretation of Genesis 1. And in fact, if you look carefully at Genesis 1, I mean, I could talk in a lot of detail about this, but just briefly, Genesis 1 actually is completely silent on the age of the earth and the age of the universe. Look at Genesis 1:1. It says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And verse 3 says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And so verse 3 is the first occurrence of the phrase, and God said. which is repeated over and over again throughout Genesis 1, and it denotes the beginning of each of the days of creation week, right? And God said, and God said. And so the first occurrence then of the day in Genesis 1, the first day, is in verse 3, by which time you've already got the heavens and the earth created in verses 1 and 2. So irrespective of what you think of the age of the biosphere, which is a separate question, the age of the universe and the age of the earth is completely silent. We're just not told how old the universe or the earth is in Genesis 1, right? So the more I look at the arguments from the young earth crowd, the more I see problems with it, and that actually it's the young earth creationist crowd that are reading in to the biblical narratives rather than the reverse. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, because I don't believe in the Bible, and also obviously that makes sense.
Yeah, but the point is that the interpretation of Ken Ham regarding Genesis 1 is not as solid as he often leads people to believe it is, because when it's a very plausible interpretation, and there are Hebrew scholars that would agree with me on this, that Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 is an indefinite period of time before the beginning of creation week. So irrespective of what you think of the days of creation week and the age of the biosphere, biological systems, animal life and plant life and so forth, the age of the earth and the age of the universe is completely not given to us in that Genesis 1 account.
Yeah, okay. Have you ever thought that you could be a heretic in church by coming up with stuff like that?
Well, I mean, this is a very I mean, there's a lot of Christians who would be considered very historic and orthodox in their faith who would agree with me on this, including biblical scholars, people who are experts in the biblical languages. For example, Dr. Jack Collins, who was who was the main translator of the Old Testament from the Hebrew for the English Standard Version of the Bible. He's written books arguing that Genesis is perfectly consistent with an old earth interpretation. So it's certainly a defensible position, I think, by Orthodox historic Christians.
Let me just jump in here, and maybe just I have a question for Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy. Can you recall of any in terms of historical early church fathers who didn't hold to a young earth view, but rather held to that the earth was an old earth in terms of the first 3 centuries at least of early Christianity, long before Darwin? Do you have any examples on the tip of your fingers?
Yes, so the example that's usually given first is Augustine of Hippo, except he was a young earth creationist, so it's misleading to say that he wasn't a young earth creationist. But however, he did not believe that the universe, he did not believe that Genesis was intended to be a literal account or a chronological sequence of events in God's creation of the universe and the earth. So he believed actually that the universe was created in an instant, and he was baffled that people thought that God would take as long as 6 days to create the earth. And so he argued for a more figurative interpretation of Genesis 1. Also, the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria took a similar view. So, but irrespective of what Augustine and others thought of the age of the earth, the point is that even before the scientific revolution, which confirmed that the universe was much older than people had previously thought, not everyone, it wasn't a universal interpretation that Genesis 1 must be taken in a strictly literal way. Does that make sense?
Yep,
okay,
yep.
yes.
So I'm going to give the time back to Brother Pepper, but just to re-emphasize for viewers watching this at home. So Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy is not a heretic for not believing in a literal reading of Genesis, because other people in historical theology as well that did that, and that's why the purpose of the question. But that's a great question, Pepper. Back to you.
I have to say that when you read the Bible in your way, the way you know, obviously from a scientific point of view, human beings could not have been created in one day, and all the animals on the land, in one day, and all the plants in one day. So when you start to do this, you arrive where I arrived at this kind of conclusion that maybe the traditional church beliefs were wrong, and I started to look for different things. So remember, I said that there were questions I could not answer. I'll just put it on the shelf, and yeah, so these questions would start to pile up. And once they did, I kind of like realized that maybe Christianity is not quite correct. So one of the things that really that I'm thinking of right now is our inability to ask God for an answer. Like, for instance, like you were saying, why would God design it this way? And then it's not God's job to answer it. It's your job to find out why. And so doesn't that negate prayer or you're saying that when we pray, we only pray for the things that we have no control over?
Yeah. So the purpose of prayer, as I see it, is to so Jesus says, if you look at the Gospel of John in chapter 14, he says, and this is often misunderstood, I think, in a lot of churches. He says, verse 14, actually verse 13 and 14, he says, whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it. Now, I actually believe that those two verses is absolutely true. And however, I also believe that not every prayer request a Christian makes is answered in the way that they are hoping for. So how then do I understand this? So what does it mean to ask in the name of Christ? And that is to ask in alignment with his will. And so to ask in alignment with his purposes, with his values in mind. So how does Jesus pray? For instance, if you look at the Gospel of Matthew in chapter number 6, where you have the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." And then so after acknowledging the holiness of God's name, what does he go on to say? What's the first thing he says? Verse 10, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." So, when we pray, our primary concern as we pray should be advancing God's kingdom, advancing his purposes. And Jesus promises that if we ask anything in his name with that purpose in view, with that objective in view, then it's ours, because that is, I think, the purpose of prayer. It's to align ourselves with God's will and to pray for advancement of his kingdom. It's not a prayer for ourselves, it's a prayer for God. Now, often that will relate to prayers for us. So if we need something in order to better advance God's kingdom, then there's prayers, also prayers of petition for saints to be well and to be healed. In terms of intercessory prayer or prayers of petition, I tend to think that whatever God always gives us what we would have prayed for had we known what he knows, had we known all of the information. Now, can I demonstrate using empirical methodology the efficacy of prayer? No, I don't think I can. There are some examples I could point to where people have written, documented miracle stories where they've prayed for something that you would think is very improbable has taken place, and that could be taken as some evidence for the efficacy of prayer. But I don't think that that you can conduct a scientific study on it, because it's difficult to get a handle on all of the various variables that are in play. For example, I think that sin can hinder one's prayer life. I think Scripture makes that clear in both the Old and the New Testament. And so there's a whole range of variables there. So I don't think it's possible to test the efficacy of prayer using empirical means. Although I do think that there is evidence that God does hear prayer, and that he does, and so that we can trust God with carrying out what is best for us. Romans 8:28 says that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And so there, as I said, God will give us whatever we would have prayed for had we known all of the information. We do have reason to think that God exists, and I think we also have reason to think that it's specifically the God that's revealed in the Bible, in the Old and New Testaments, that exists. And therefore, even without knowing all the information that God has in regards to answered or unanswered prayer, I think that we can trust that God indeed intends to work out his purposes, and God is indeed listening. Does that make sense?
Yes, your explanation, I understand your explanation, but I have reservations about it. What you've said is very similar to what my Muslim friends would always end their sentences with, and they will always say, Inshallah. Inshallah means God's will, God's will. So if you said, hey, I've got a birthday party this Saturday, can you come? And he goes, yeah, I can come, Inshallah. Which means that if he doesn't come, it's God's will that he did not come. So don't blame him. It was God's will that he didn't come. Now, I can understand when like, let's say his car just would not start, or he had been taken away because there was an emergency and he had forgotten to tell me. That's fine. But this God's will would also fall in the same category of just didn't feel like coming. But later on, this and this happened. So I guess it was God's will that I didn't come, because if I had gone to your party, then I wouldn't have had this, this and this. This and this couldn't have happened for me. And it's very much that God of the gaps thing, where you're using this God's will. We don't know what His will is, but it's like this big mystery. And sometimes it does work, and sometimes it doesn't work. When it works, we proclaim the praises to God, and we give testimony in church. And when it doesn't work, then we just say, well, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know really why it hasn't worked. Or maybe it did work, but in a different way that but you just don't know. But that doesn't mean that God hasn't done His job, so to speak. I think that's not
so
quite
I think
right.
I think it would be a God of the gaps fallacy if I was using it as an argument for God. If I was using answered prayer as an argument for God and ignoring where there was apparently unanswered prayer, then I think that I would think that would be a cogent argument. However, I'm not making that as an argument.
Sure.
That's something that I believe because I trust God. Sure. And I trust him because of the public evidences which shows that he exists, and that he's revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. Sure. So actually, that's a good segue. In the last little section here before we wrap up, I would just be interested to hear your perspective on some of the what I consider to be very strong positive evidences for Christianity being true. Would you like to maybe talk about this for a little bit?
Okay.
So, I mean, when you were a Christian, I mean, had you researched some of the evidences for instance, the resurrection of Jesus?
Yes. In fact, the doctorate thesis which I sent in was on the sonship of Jesus Christ. So in it also I mentioned that he is not dead, that he had resurrected, and that there were all these eyewitness evidence and et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I'm quite familiar with it. But I have to say that my memory may not serve me as well, because it's been many years since I left. Okay.
So when it comes to explaining the relevant data regarding the resurrection, I think there are 4 categories of hypotheses, which I would suggest are mutually exhaustive. That is, that the disciples, in fact, didn't claim he rose from the dead. It's actually a later myth. That would be the myth hypothesis. Or secondly, that the apostles themselves did claim Jesus rose from the dead, but they lied about it. That's the conspiracy hypothesis. Or thirdly, they claimed he rose from the dead, but they were honestly mistaken about it, so they were deluded. Or fourth, Jesus actually did rise from the dead, which is the hypothesis I myself subscribe to. Now,
this is a very Josh McDowell kind of argument.
Maybe, although yeah. So if we go over, so what's the first So the first hypothesis I raised was that, in fact, the disciples didn't, in fact, claim Jesus rose from the dead, but it's a later developing myth. So I think we can eliminate that by looking at the evidence. So, for example, the Apostle Paul was someone who was personally acquainted with Jesus' closest disciple Peter and Jesus' own brother James. If we look at so in the early to mid 50s AD. The Apostle Paul wrote a letter from Ephesus to the church in Corinth that we now know as 1 Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says in verse 3 to 7, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." And so he summarizes the gospel that Christ was he was killed, he was buried, he was raised again on the third day. And then he goes on to say, and he appeared to various people. And he says, "For I am the least of the apostles. I'm worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached and so he believed." And so Paul assumes that his proclamation of the resurrection is consistent with what's already been preached by the Jerusalem church. That's why he says in verse 11, "Whether and it was I or they, so we preached and so he believed." And we know independently from 1 Corinthians 1 that the Corinthians were acquainted with the preaching of Peter or Cephas, because Paul chides the Corinthians for having divisions and factions in their midst. Some say, "I follow Cephas," others Apollos, others "I follow Paul," others "I follow Christ." And Paul basically says, guys, we're all on the same team here. So, so Paul seems to indicate that that Peter and James affirmed the resurrection, and we could also demonstrate that from the Gospels and Acts as well. And so then I think we can rule out the first of those four contending hypotheses, and we can actually establish that the apostles themselves claimed that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Also, Luke, who was a traveling companion of Paul, had access to eyewitnesses. We know that because he claims to be a traveling companion of Paul. There's good evidence supporting that. And also in Acts 21, with Paul, he goes to Jerusalem and meets with the Jerusalem leadership, including James in particular is mentioned there. And he was present along with Paul in Caesarea for 2 years, where he would have had ample access to that treasure trove of living witnesses to the resurrection. And Luke shows himself to be a very reliable, faithful historian who's a habitual truth teller, because he has a lot of accuracy in his reportage of events that he talks about. Especially in Acts, we've got so many documented cases in the book of Acts in particular for his accuracy as an historian. And so Luke, I think, was in a position to be in the know as to what was being claimed by the Jerusalem apostles. And yet he represents in the book of Acts chapter 2 and also Luke 24 and other places that the resurrection experiences where they were attested to by the apostles, those that claimed to be eyewitnesses. And so what about the second hypothesis that they were, or the hypothesis they were honestly mistaken? Well, I think there's good evidence against that. For instance, when we look at the gospel reports, which I think we've got good evidence for being grounded in eyewitness testimony, the resurrection experiences are polymodal or multisensory in nature, involving not just sight, but multiple sensory modes, including physical contact with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, group conversations with Jesus. According to Acts chapter 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period. So it wasn't just one brief, confusing episode. And that's something that's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about, having breakfast with, physical contact with, etc., group conversations with someone that was crucified a few days ago. So the third hypothesis then is that the disciples deliberately lied about it. And I think there's good evidence against that. For instance, the fact that they were willing to die as martyrs for their faith. Now, many people will die for something that they believe to be true, but very few people die for something that they know to be false. And multi-party conspiracies, when life or liberty are at stake, invariably break down. Whereas we've got good attestation in particular for Peter dying as a martyr, and he was, of course, afraid of death to the point that he denies the Lord 3 times to save his own skin. James, the Lord's brother, we have good evidence for, was a martyr for his faith. We've got good evidence, I think, in the gospel accounts that Jesus' brothers were not believers in him during his lifetime. And so I like to ask the skeptic, how much would it take to convince you that your elder brother was the Yahweh of the Old Testament to the point of martyrdom? I think something pretty radical. And then thirdly, James the son of Zebedee, his martyrdom is recounted in the book of Acts. So, which is a first century source, and so very early. As I said, liars make poor martyrs, and so that provides evidence, I think, against the hypothesis that they were setting out deliberately to deceive people. And so then finally, the hypothesis, which I think best explains all the relevant evidence, is that Jesus in fact did rise from the dead. And I think that's just the best explanation of all the relevant data. Do you have anything to say on any of that?
Yes. Jesus is, if I look at history, I think Jesus is not the only person who fits that criteria, where there was eyewitness accounts and there's no reason for you to conspire. And you could take almost any living God. The one that comes to mind would be Sai Baba from India. Mm-hmm. And I've got an uncle and aunt who are staunch Sai Baba devotees, and they will just tell you that, I swear he made that ash appear out of nowhere, and I have that ash, and it's kept in some. My uncle is still alive, but every time he tells me that story, I just can't wrap my head around it. And and he would tell you that he saw it, he was there, he received it, but then again, if you ask a person like James Randi, he would say, it's just a very simple magic trick. It's sleight of hand. So I have to say that the eyewitness and it really brings a lot of but maybe the other thing is, I was also surprised to find that the life of Jesus, the way he was born and the way he died, also was parallel a lot of other gods, Greek gods and Egyptian gods. So I was also surprised. His birth and his death was not unique. It's almost like it's been around for a long time. Okay. So even events in his life really can parallel a few other gods, Egyptian and Greek gods. So okay. I really started to doubt because of that.
So yeah, I have a few things to say on that. So you mentioned Sai Baba and him bringing ash into existence out of nowhere, apparently. And yeah, I'm familiar with Sai Baba, and his tricks have been exposed as conjuring tricks, yes, as I'm sure you're aware. And yes. What I would say on that is that there's a difference between someone being able to perform a conjuring trick, like bringing a watch into his hand, into the palm of his hand, or ash, whatever it happens to be, and someone who's crucified by the Romans, confirmed dead, placed in a tomb for 3 days, and then on the third day, walking out of the tomb and appearing to his friends, eating breakfast with his friends, having group conversations with them. Over a 40-day period. I mean, I think there's no real parallel there. I mean, it's much easier to perform a conjuring trick where you bring ash, where you conjure ash into the palm of your hand, versus walking around talking eating breakfast with your friends after you've just been crucified by the Romans. So that's one point I'd say. On the second issue you brought up, which is alleged parallels between Jesus' life and pagan deities. What's your source on that? I mean, I'm suspecting perhaps that you've been influenced by the Zeitgeist movie, which is on YouTube. Am I correct, or did you have another source?
Zeitgeist was one of the movies which I watched. But however, even before that, I already had a very, well, I could say a brilliant uncle who is a Christian. He's still a Christian today, but he was the first one who pointed out that the life of Christ was actually is very similar to, I can't remember this Egyptian god's name already. It's been a long time since I thought of these
Osiris,
things.
Is it?
Osiris, maybe? Yeah, it sounds familiar. Or maybe it's a name I saw of a spaceship in a movie. I'm not sure, but it could be. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wrote a review years ago with the Zeitgeist movie.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the problem with the Zeitgeist movie is that virtually every single claim in the movie is false, just factually. And there's not a single source that they cite to actually substantiate any of their claims. And if you actually go and read the primary source literature for yourself, you'll see that actually none of their claims are actually true in the first place. And so it's unfortunate that a lot of atheists are swayed by it, because it resembles what atheists often charge Christians with, which is believing things without any evidence. So the Zeitgeist maybe makes these claims, and a lot of atheists just buy into it without actually investigating whether the claims are actually correct or not. And that troubles me to some extent. When we actually dive into the claims, I'll just give you a few examples. So Horus was one of the deities that's mentioned in the Zeitgeist movie. And it says, this is Horus. He is a sun god of Egypt of around 3000 BC. Now, Horus actually wasn't just a sun god. He was also the falcon god, whose name means the far off one. And Ra was the sun god who came to be identified with the midday sun. And in addition, Horus was also the sky god, whose good or sound eye was the sun, and his injured eye was the moon. The Zeitgeist movie continues. It says, he is a sun anthropomorphized, and his life is a series of allegorical myths involving the sun's movement in the sky. And this is just inaccurate. Horus wasn't the sun, but came to be identified with the position of the rising sun. And later he was associated with the sun god Ra. Atum was the god of the setting sun. The Zeitgeist movie says, and I quote, from the ancient hieroglyphs in Egypt, we know much about the solar messiah. For instance, Horus, being the sun or the light, had an enemy known as Set, and Set was the personification of the darkness or night. Now, Seth, who was Horus's brother, was Horus's rival and the usurper of the throne of Egypt. And there's a debate as to whether the struggle between Horus and Seth was primarily geopolitical or symbolic in nature. When the full Osiris complex becomes visible, Seth appears as the murderer of Osiris and the would-be killer of the child Horus. The Zeitgeist movie says, and metaphorically speaking, every morning Horus would win the battle against Set, while in the evening Set would conquer Horus and send him into the underworld. It's important to note that dark versus light, or good versus evil, is one of the most ubiquitous mythological dualities ever known, and still expressed on many levels to this day. But that the movie's claim is just simply wrong. Horus was never sent to the underworld. It was Osiris who was killed and became lord of the underworld, and Horus was king of the living. And then very strangely, the movie says that, and I quote, broadly speaking, the story of Horus is as follows. Horus was born December 25th. Now, first of all, that's simply not the case. And at any rate, neither the Bible nor Christianity claim that Jesus was born December 25th. So any parallels with ancient legends are completely inconsequential. It goes on to say he was born of the Virgin Isis Mary, which is simply, again, wrong. Horus was born of Isis, and there's absolutely no mention in any Egyptian literature of the trailing name Mary, as the movie would suggest. And in fact, Isis wasn't a virgin, but she was the widow of Osiris, the father of Horus. The video literally just makes stuff up as it goes along. I mean, literally every single claim in the movie is just factually wrong. And if you actually go and check out the sources for yourself, I think you'll come to the same realization. In fact, atheists who are scholars actually would agree with me on that. And so it's not just me saying that, but if you go and ask Bart Ehrman, for example, he would agree with me on that.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Because mythology is such that they're just stories, and stories change, and they don't care, because it's just a story. And if you are from this part of the world, you will hear the story this way. And if you're from this part of the world, the same story, the same names, the same characters would have different stories. Some would have fewer stories, or some would have more. Even the parents might change. So I'm not surprised that if mythology, if someone reads mythology and you got several versions of that mythology. So I wouldn't be surprised about that.
But the point is that the Zeitgeist movie doesn't cite any sources, and when you actually consult the original primal literature, there's just nothing to substantiate what's being said. And so go ahead.
No, so yes, Zeitgeist movie aside, there are also other. I think I've actually read mythology. I've watched the Zeitgeist movie, but I did not base my atheism on that movie. Yes, that movie was interesting, but when I went to read about mythology, I also noticed parallels between the life of Jesus and other pagan gods or mythical gods. I can give you a local example. I once went into a Hindu temple, and there was a deity. There was a lady, and her name is Mariam. And when the temple leader gave a short talk about the history of this temple, and he openly said, "This is Mary. This is the Mary that you Christians worship and believe in. This is Mary, but we know her as Mariam," which is you can see the name has got some. But when he told the story of Mariam and the Mary that I know from the Bible, they are really different stories. So I understand that mythology sometimes changes, it evolves, depending on the storyteller. So this is not fact. Yeah.
Mary's
Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy, before you answer that, I think this is going to be either the last or the second last question. I think time is fleeting, unfortunately. We go on and on. So we just said, maybe if you answer this really quick, we may have a chance for just, maybe one more question from Pepper before we wrap up. So yeah, do go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Mcclatchy.
So you'd have to provide documentation of pagan parallels, so we could go and evaluate those. Mary's a common name, so I'm not sure simply having a parallel with someone called Mary in another account is good support for. And in fact, many of these cases that have been alleged are actually from sources which actually post-date the New Testament writings. So I just don't find that argument at all compelling. And the New Testament sources are grounded in real events. We can actually document. We've got tons of evidence substantiating the substantial reliability of the New Testament documents, the Gospels and Acts, etc. And we don't have comparable evidence at all for these Egyptian and other pagan mythologies.
Yeah, I suppose. But again, whenever somebody mentions the word mythology, I think that everybody should just take those stories with a pinch of salt. It's non-factual. Is this ridiculous for us to think that up on Mount Olympus is Zeus and his gang, always fighting Hades and his gang, and for me, I just make that one more step further. That in heaven there is no God sitting there and looking and making sure that his children, the Christians, are being helped by him, and his angels are protecting them. I also just equate the biblical God with Zeus and everybody else, every other god that you can think of. That's what I yeah.
So the problem I have with that objection is a very common objection. Christopher Hitchens and plenty other atheists have made that sort of argument that we're all atheists with respect to that pantheon of other gods. We just go one god further. But there's a world of difference between a universe that was brought into being by a god and a universe which is devoid of any intelligence, devoid of any design, and which was the product of purposeless chance and necessity. There's a huge gulf between those two positions. And so it's not simply saying, okay, we're just going to go one god further, but going from a theistic universe to a non-theistic universe, I think is a huge gap. And furthermore, another problem with your objection is that I can parody the argument quite easily. For instance, we both reject that 99.999% of all the people that has ever lived on the earth is currently president or ever has been president of the United States. I just go one president further and deny that Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Well, you would say, but there's overwhelming evidence that Donald Trump is the president of the United States. You can't do that. And I would say the same thing with regards to the truth of Christianity. I think there's overwhelming evidence that Christianity is true. And so your objection would only really be convincing if I thought there was as much evidence for Christianity as there is for that pantheon of other religious claims and traditions.
Right. Before we get to Pepper, this is going to be the last question, Pepper, and I need to give you.
I think this is a great note to end at. Yeah. Why do atheists go one God further, and then here are the Christians going, well, there really is one president. There is a real president of the United States. So maybe we should end on this. This could be an interesting place to end at.
Absolutely, Pepper. Thanks so much for. I mean, I was going to give you one more, if you wanted to, but since you wanted it to end here, I really thank you, Pepper, for coming along, and you have been such a great sport and have embodied, like a really, really kind and a character that of wanting to learn, and I can, like I said in the last video, I can testify that having been to your center as well in Apostle, that this is who you are really in person as well. So we're really grateful that you have come on just and explain apologetics to share your thoughts and questions, Pepper.
Well, I think it was interesting that Dr. Jonathan has explained it the way he has explained it. I think that's really interesting. This is the first time I've heard it explained this way, and it's not one of those, well, if you had but it's Dr. Jonathan knows his stuff, and I think that it's interesting. I think I might be challenged to look it up and to learn a little bit more, so that I understand where he's coming from. Right now, really, I don't understand where you're coming from. There's so many, yeah.
If I come to Malaysia possibly next year, Pepper, I'd love to meet up and have a more informal, off-camera discussion about these things.
Yeah, come to our country. We need your money.
Right. So for those of you who are watching, Explain Apologetics is trying really, really hard, and I have every reason to believe it will happen. Hopefully May next year, we'll be able to bring down Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy. We have also perhaps another one or two more special guests that may be joining us. Do stay tuned as we give you more announcements for that. But I do have to give a special thanks to Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy for your time, and just coming on here and handling those questions, providing your expertise in the area of evolutionary biology. Really amazing stuff, and thank you so much for that.
Thanks, it's been great being here.
Absolutely. And those of you watching at home, we hope that you've benefited just from hearing an exchange. And remember that an open, honest exchange like this beats the hate-filled comments that you see sometimes in the comment section of videos, in Facebook and social media, but there's no really interaction one way or the other. It's just a lot of hate comments and all that. This is what we are trying to establish here in Explain Apologetics, an open conversation about our faith. And of course, no secrets is all. Our ultimate prayer is that Pepper and all of those who have left Christianity will find their faith back again in Christ. Yes, that's our prayer, but it's up to Pepper, of course, to review all that we have said, and also for us to consider what he has said as well. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for those of you watching at home. As usual, if you haven't quite subscribed to Explain Apologetics yet, that red button is right there in the bottom, begging for you to click on it. And if you do click on it, please also click the notification bell so that you get notified anytime we go live. That's all for this week in Explain Apologetics. We'll be back next week on Monday with a special interview on how you can apply apologetics in evangelism with a brother called Jonathan. That will be posted on Monday night, 7 p.m. Until then, on behalf of Dr. Jonathan Mcclatchy, Pepper Lim, and myself, Samuel Nesan, glad you could join us. Bye for now.